Welcome to Grief Heals, the podcast that explores how grief heals. Join us as we consider how grief invites love within ourselves, our communities, our world, our histories, and how it is that grief heals. I'm Lisa Michelle Zega here with Eric Simpson. Hello again, Eric.
Hi.
So today we're following up the episode on forgiveness and the connection to grief with shame and its connection to grief. How does that sound?
Yeah, they all kind of stick together, don't they? Like grief, forgiveness, and shame as concepts.
Yeah, I'm recognizing that as just hearing you say it like that, I'm like, wow, how is that so? That grief, shame, and forgiveness often do stick together as concept.
Well, when we talked in our episode about forgiveness, we talked about how unforgiveness without grief leads to sort of a condition of shame, or shame can propel that.
Yes. Shame is one of these things that we tend to want to move far away from, which actually helps shame to grow because we want to leave it in the dark, like it's not there. And that's really where shame flourishes, is behind the scenes and in the dark, where it's not named, it's not
Mhm.
recognized. But often shame is wrapped around wounds that need healing, and to be healed they need to come into the light, they need to be tended to, they need to be given nurture, given attention, given, right, like wounds need to be tended. And they will fester in the darkness, and shame does its best work in the darkness. Also, forgiveness is often needed to release shame. So I mean, these are just initial thoughts that I've got, but let's slow down a little bit and see if we can defining grief, defining forgiveness, and defining shame, or at least giving some parameters around these.
Let's start with just a cognitive definition of shame,
Okay.
and then we can bring in forgiveness and grief, because I think that you have a lot to say about the interior experience of shame. I like the definition of shame as an identity, is identifying with a behavior or a status. And I think I may have gotten that some of that from Brene Brown, who explains shame cognitively very well. But
Yeah,
I
if
think,
you haven't heard Brene Brown's, and I'm not talking to you, Eric, I'm because I believe you have, but regardless, I highly, highly recommend her TED Talk on shame. And of course, she talks about shame in a lot of her books, but that TED Talk is a great start in an understanding. And that's it. Like if we were to distinguish between, say, shame and guilt, shame is about who I am. I
right.
am bad. I am wrong. I am a slut. I am weak. I am selfish. I am,
Or there's just something wrong with me. And so I can't really expose myself to other people. I have to really
yes,
take care to only let them see certain parts, the parts that look good
I'm
to me.
fundamentally flawed. And so
Right.
if you get close enough, you will reject me because
Mm-hmm.
you will see that I am just wrong. I am just bad. I mean, I'm speaking as a woman who much of my life was ruled by shame, and shame has been a major player in my life. Shame is it's a pernicious and yet elusive little creature, if I could call it that. And shame has wielded a lot more power when it was unidentified. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a long time, most of my life, until my late 30s, early 40s, where I even identified, oh, I'm ruled by shame. I think that I'm fundamentally flawed. I didn't even name that. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know to name that initially. So shame is more like an I am, guilt is more like an I did, right?
Right. I think it's interesting too, because when we were talking in our last podcast about forgiveness, I mentioned that it's easier for me to forgive others when I realize that I'm in need of forgiveness. Now, somebody could take that and say, well, it sounds like you're experiencing shame. You're saying you're flawed, they're flawed, everybody's not just flawed, but everybody's just messed up and in need of forgiveness. There's a difference, I think, between shame and humility. And humility is seeing ourselves as we are, the good and the bad
Yeah.
aspects together. It's not, crawling around on the ground like a mongrel or something. I wanted to make that distinction because I think that when we talk about forgiveness and the role of grief in forgiveness, then we can talk about humility as in opposition to shame.
The thought that's coming to mind is also from our last episode, which I really recommend, on the connection between forgiveness and grief, and how our forgiveness without grief is actually incomplete. But one of the things that happened to me in real time in our last episode was recognizing a pendulum swing of my existence. And this pendulum swing might happen multiple times in one day, where I went from being the high king, the ruler who, demanded of the people in my life, or the lowly pauper, the peasant who's groveling and begging for a right to exist. I'll do anything. I'll do whatever you want. I'll dance like a monkey. Just please let me back into the party. And this happened most notably in my very close relationships. So think my mom or my husband, or right, like really the people that were doing life most intimately with me
Mhm.
would experience me as high king or lowly peasant in many situations. Shame either propped me up or brought me low, demanding justice or begging for mercy.
Mhm.
And I see that a lot, like in our culture too. And I think that what that is grief or humanity or love has not been brought in to these places of our shame. The strange thing about shame in its nature, when we are gripped by it, tells us we must flee, tells us we must hide. No one can know, no one can see, right? What heals us is to come close, is to be seen, to be heard, to be witnessed. I needed to come close to my own wounds and allow others close to my own wounds of feeling that I was a reject. What's weird about my situation, or what I find weird, is I'm so loud, I'm so out there. I don't think most people would have identified that this is a woman whose life is ruled by shame, a woman who can get up on stage and like not flinch. People talk about public speaking being something that is so fearful for many people. That's never been my experience.
Mhm.
I was the kid in school with her hand raised the absolute highest, right? That was also a way to protect myself from shame. Oh, I wasn't with my vulnerability, with my weakness, with my fears. I was really deeply afraid of being seen in my smallness, which was really just in my humanity.
Mhm.
And then when inevitably that would come out, now I'm a beggar. Now I'm the worst, and I'm begging for forgiveness to be welcomed back in.
There seems to be a sense in which when we experience shame as a status, as which is what it is, but I think shame, that becomes validated when we do things that are wrong. And we say, well, I did that because obviously I'm this bad person. And then what we all do is project because we don't want to see that in ourselves. And we go from being the subject of, being the peasant who's being judged by the king, which is how we see other people viewing us, to become, or how we view ourselves, to becoming the king because we project and see those elements that we see in ourselves onto other people. and you can kind of go back and forth on that pendulum.
Projection is it's powerful. There is a saying in the realm of coaching that says, if you spot it, you got it, right? If I can see it in you, it lives in me. I used to only see that, and I think this is actually because of shame. I only would see that in a quote unquote like negative light. Like, oh, if I can see that your selfishness, well, then I've got that in me. If I can see your hustle, right?
Mhm.
Like this performance way of being in the world, oh, then I've got that in me. It's also, though, and I think that grief, maybe this sounds like a stretch, but that grief allows this human experience where no, it's all the things. If I can see your brilliance, it's because that resides in me. If I
Right.
can see your compassion, I love the word metabolizing. I love the word integrating. I love the word composting. Anything that is bringing together the fullness of our humanity. I love a circle more
Mhm.
than a straight line, like with a polarization from one end to the next, because everything touches and meets and the fullness of coming together, like that's human.
That's the definition of the Jungian term individuation, which is to bring all the aspects of yourself that are in the unconscious, things that we don't know about ourselves, but that we project onto others, to bring all of those into communion within ourselves and become a whole self. And that's the meaning of perfection is this wholeness or fullness.
That's how I understand it. And when I say understand, Eric, I'm actually, part of me is talking about the understanding in my mind, but part of me is talking about this understanding in my body, where in my lived experience,
Mhm.
in this vessel I inhabit, I feel more whole as I continue to welcome more parts of myself. I'm noticing a longing for a wholeness, a coming together, recognizing the things I detest are in me, the things I
Mhm.
admire and esteem are in me, this coming together, this allowing and integration.
It seems like the more that you have that, and the way that we've been talking about this the whole time we've been doing the podcast, is that grief is instrumental in that process or the process of individuation, even. The grief,
Yeah,
we've talked about grief as a path or a doorway into that. Grief is love,
yeah.
and love
And
is what does that. And
exactly. And one thing I want to say, to use this opportunity to define grief, I would say grief is actually love to the losses that have been
mhm,
experienced by you, meaning by an individual, by a community, by a world, like bringing love to the places of loss. This is what it is to grieve,
mhm,
right? I do define grief as love, but then to break that down, it's like bringing the love to the places
mhm.
that are carrying the loss, that are holding the loss. That is where love must get in. And then forgiveness. I love the definition. I think I'm quoting some semblance of it that I heard in the grief recovery method, releasing the hope for a different or better yesterday.
Mhm.
And then also that you brought in on the last podcast episode of releasing the I don't know whether you said desire, but to bring any sort of retribution, punishment, any getting back for the action. It's like, no,
Right.
releasing that as well.
Forgiveness comes in then when you are processing your losses and your pain and your feeling of shame through grief. The experience of shame is an identity.
There was a time where I was told at a young age that I had a black heart
Wow.
and that I was the most selfish person
Mhm.
that this person had ever experienced. I was, I don't know, 4 years old.
Oh, geez.
There was a part of me that really believed that and was desperately afraid of it. And that really fueled that pendulum swing of that I'm the high king or the lowly pauper.
Right.
Yeah, let's just give a practical, how would grief come into a story like that? The older I've gotten and recognizing what I lost while believing, not that I was human, but I was the most selfish human, which made me inhuman. And then the fear surrounding that and how that impacted my own experience of living, my relationships, my identity. Can I grieve for that little girl? Can I bring love to her? Because to this day, Eric, where that shows up today in business, I can think of an example. I'm working a contract. The person that I am reporting to for this contract comes in. She tells me something that is missing because I literally, my whole body, head to toe, gets flooded with this sense that I'm in trouble. That it showed up as, I can't be in trouble. I can't have done wrong because I will be expelled from the human race. And so one of the reasons that grief has become so precious to me is because grief said, you're human amongst humans. There are no straight lines in nature. You get to exist. You get to make mistakes. You get to forgive. You get to, like, it just literally leveled the playing field not in a way that made me high king or lowly pauper, but just humble human.
Mhm.
But still in my nervous system, like I needed to self-soothe to bring myself back to the present moment so I could show up as a 53-year-old woman navigating this contract with another woman, and there was no problem. But I'm cognizant that this lives in me and have tools to come back to the present, right? So that I can engage and then go back and comfort that little young part of me that's like so deeply afraid of being in trouble, because being in trouble means you are a bad girl and you get exiled. You're not just a bad girl, you're the worst bad girl. And then forgiving myself and forgiving the people involved while grieving, like it's a very whole process. It's not a flat line, and it's not linear, and it's not, like I've heard grief described as scribbles that circle back and forth. But isn't life like that? Isn't nature, aren't the seasons? I mean, don't we see a cyclical nature all around us? Isn't that living? I don't know for certain if this was the first place that I read this or heard this, but I will reference it. Kurt Thompson wrote a book called The Soul of Shame. And he talks about the neurobiology of shame. And one of the things that stood out to me was he made a distinction between shame and guilt developmentally, right?
Mhm.
So guilt being, I am in relation to you, Eric, I can see how my actions impacted you. Guilt would live in that sort of a
Mhm.
framework.
Right.
Shame is all about me. It's like it may show up in the future of how I interact with people, but shame is not about how I impacted you. It's more the idea that if I impacted you, it's because of who I am, how I am, right? The distinction that really just gave so much freedom to this precious heart of mine was that developmentally, a child is not even able to experience guilt, my actions in relationship to another human, until they're around 3 years old or later. Shame, on the other hand, can be experienced. In his book, I want to say he referenced it back to 18 months old. I'm also reading a book called Scared Sick that really talks about human development all the way in the embryo. And it makes sense to me based on what I've learned that a fetus could have an experience of shame because they're responding to what's going on. Like
Mhm.
their whole biology is being developed in the context of what's going on in the mother from the mother's DNA in the environment. This may just need to be for another episode, but the idea that a child can experience shame before they're ever able to distinguish themselves and their actions from other humans. And somehow learning that helped me put my shame experience in perspective and
Mhm.
helped me to bring so much compassion, not just to myself, but to other humans. Because what happens is we experience shame and then we build stories of our existence around the shame that precedes the story,
Mhm.
precedes our cognitive understanding, is pre-verbal. That felt like a very key piece to understand in terms of processing, forgiving, grieving.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that there are many identities that are marginalized, that are subjects of shame in our culture and other cultures. Like, for example, a person born into poverty.
Yes.
When you talk about the biological development of shame, like being as early as in the womb, it seems to me that somebody who's born into the status of shame, that would just make it easier for them to internalize all of
Yes.
the things that are said about them.
Our sense of social coherence, right, also is an indicator of like the shame that we'll experience. So if I feel like an outsider, or I'm identified, let's say it that way, as an outsider, and that's my existence. I'm born into that, and that is fed in the culture that I'm in.
Mhm.
Absolutely, that
Right.
will intensify an experience of shame. And that is why doing work like what we're doing here, where we name these things, that simple act of naming what's going on is the beginning of recognition to bring freedom and healing and the wholeness that you talked about in this integration of who we are, not just as an individual, in our relationships, in our communities, in our world. It's literally why my understanding, or how rather, my understanding that grief heals emerged.
You've been listening to Grief Heals with Lisa Michelle Zega. The podcast is produced by me, Eric Simpson, in association with Jump Up and Down Productions. Music by Ken Delian, Drunken Nights to Sunday Mornings, and Stefan Carlin, A Calming Ocean, A Common Notion. If you would like more information about the work Lisa does, point your browsers to legityou.com. That's LEGITYOU. Lisa can also be reached at Lisa Michelle at legityou.com. This has been a Jump Up and Down production.